So Microsoft is ending Windows 10 support, kind of, in the foreseeable future. If you're not aware of the news, let me just clearly say to you in the best manner that I can. Windows 10 update supports for specifically security, if I recall correctly, is not going to happen anymore beginning on 14 October of 2025. What this essentially means that Windows 10 is just not going to get any more updates, and you are kind of forced to go to Windows 11 unless you want to jump to Linux. This is something that kind of itches my brain, and I feel the need to talk about it. And I also have to warn you, if you use Linux, you might be slightly offended of what I'm about to say. So yeah, whatever. There's a lot of talk about going to Linux instead of going to Windows 11, mainly because Windows 11 is filled with bloatware and you are forced to use online accounts for Windows 11 and whatnot. And to me, it's kind of boring. I honestly am not a fan of Windows 11, mainly because I don't even understand why Microsoft decided to even create Windows 11. I just don't. There was absolutely no point in creating Windows 11. I think 10 was just completely fine. And now Windows 10 is losing support, and a lot of people are thinking of maybe jumping to Linux. If you are one of those people that are thinking of going to Linux, then let me tell you a few things that you may want to know before doing that. So a lot of the worries about that I have seen, and I don't have a direct reference to this, so just take my words for granted or not, take it with a grain of salt. It's about gaming on Linux. Now there's something called Proton DB or something, don't recall the name too well. It's kind of like an emulator of Windows apps, in this case games, and it can run on Linux, which is great. So let me just stop here for a brief moment and just say that this is excellent. I think that's a fantastic thing. And for people that just don't want to use Windows anymore and they still want a game, there's a lot of options for you to play from these emulators. I call them emulators. They're not really emulators apparently, but I like to call them for simplicity's sake. Anyways, that is for games. Now, I'm not sure about the apps. I believe that most applications that the world uses is not, frankly, Linux friendly. So if you're gonna try to use, let's say, Excel, I believe you cannot use it on Linux, which is kind of complicated because it's used pretty much in a lot of places, I believe. And that's just one thing. You can, for example, use Visual Studio, which is something that is Windows only, and a lot of people use Visual Studio. A lot of people use Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, and there's obviously other options. You don't have to use that. I'm just saying that if you're used to the IDE and you want to go to Linux and try to use that, you can't. That's a problem because, as far as I know, a lot of people use it. Then we have other apps that just don't even care about giving Linux support. And then we have one of the most complicated things on Linux, in my honest opinion. And it's something that's not usually talked about. It's probably a barrier of entry to a lot of people too, which is the amount of distros that exist in the Linux environment. Now, I found this cool website here that displays pretty much all Linux distributions and their popularity. And I gotta be honest, I had no idea there were these many. Now, anyways, I think that the fact that there's so many distros, like if I want to get to Linux and I think to myself, okay, what is Linux? Is Linux a Windows? Do I just type Linux? Do I just download Linux and just use it? Well, no, you don't. There's distros from Linux. These distributions are based on Linux. They're Linux based, kind of like the Linux is the kernel code, is like the base blocks of the distributions that people use. And then we have stuff like Ubuntu, we have Linux Mint, we have Debian, we have Arch Linux, and we have a lot of many others. There's, like I said, there's too many actually. And my opinion here is exactly that. There's too many distributions. There's way too many distros, too many. And I think that the fact that there's so many options, you cannot choose properly. You cannot ask Google and say, which Linux distro should I use? It's going to give you kind of a vague answer. And no one can really tell you what kind of distro should you use, because it depends. It depends on what you want to do, apparently. I do believe there's no actual Linux distribution that is actually very equal to Windows. just simple, just works out of the box, easy to learn, easy to understand. And speaking of easiness, that's another barrier of entrance to Linux, in my honest opinion. And again, I could be wrong, and a lot of people are gonna say, oh, but a lot of distros nowadays are really good, they're really simple, they're just plug and play. And no, that's not true. That's not true. I recently used Ubuntu, and there's a lot of graphical interface there. It's friendly. It's someone who uses Windows daily is going to use Ubuntu, for example, or Linux Mint, which were the distros that I used. That's right, again, and they're gonna be kind of familiar. They're gonna be like, oh, this is actually simple to use. But I have encountered errors, and to fix those errors, usually I have to go to the terminal and write some command lines. And I'll be flat out honest here. This is going to take a lot of people's brains, but I gotta say it, no one's going to do that. I'm sorry. No one likes to write command lines in terminals like you do. I know the Linux community loves to do that. I know a lot of people do, but most people don't. Most people that use Windows are not even familiar with the terminal. So you cannot expect millions, maybe even billions of people who are used to an operating system that is simple to use, easy to understand, and available and approachable. No, just expect him to come to Linux and just, oh, you got a problem? Like, I know all about the command lines of terminal. So just like this, and that, and XYZ, and just like this, and like this more, and I'll just click enter, and like, people are not gonna do that. It just doesn't work that way. I know a lot of people like it, but that's not how the world works. I'm sorry to tell you, that's not how it works. Most people don't do that. And most people won't do that. They will not do it. They won't. They just won't. I'm sorry to tell you, they just won't. You have to accept that reality. And I see a lot of Linux users saying, oh, come to Linux. It's the best distro, best stuff, best operating system ever, man. It's the total replacement of Windows. Well, it isn't. It's not. Linux cannot replace Windows yet. Not yet, because it's kind of complicated. There's still bugs in distros, a lot of them. No distribution of Linux is completely free of bugs. You're going to encounter them at some point, and you're going to depend on the terminal, most likely. And you just cannot expect a normal person who's just used to use simple things out of the box to suddenly go search on the web or stuff like that. You cannot incentivize them. You cannot change people's opinions like that. So combining all of these things together, the lack of actually native availability of apps or programs, however you want to call them, and even gaming, like there's not a lot of actually native Linux games that were actually built within a Linux environment. Most of them were built on a Windows environment, and some of them port to Linux because they can be compiled. You can compile to Linux code, and it just works there. I can even talk about the one I used, which is Unreal Engine. There is a way to use Unreal Engine on Linux, which is actually Ubuntu. They recommend Ubuntu, a certain version of it. I'm not entirely a fan of doing it because the setup to do that seems to be kind of complicated, and I'm not a fan of complicated things, so I don't want to go through the hassle of actually just booting up Linux just to use that, just to use my engine of choice. So I just prefer to be on Windows. And to conclude, unfortunately, I am going to stick with Windows for the time being until the Linux community finally decides that, hold on, there's way too many distros. Why don't we just combine all our efforts? Everyone, just the whole Linux community, just gets themselves together and say, let's build an actual distribution that actually works out of the box just like Windows. It has absolutely no problems, or as minimal as possible, and the user rarely or never has to type any command line on the terminal. Maybe one day this will happen, maybe it will never happen. But until an actual Linux distribution that is really like Windows, like I said, it's simplicity, until that happens, then Linux will never replace Windows. No matter how bad Windows may get, there will still be other options. There will be Mac, there will be just going mobile. People will still even use older versions of Windows. They just don't care. That's the reality for what it seems to me. That's what I believe is going to continue to happen until there's an actual Linux distribution that just works properly. And that is easy to find. We need less distributions of Linux. We need to concentrate the efforts into one thing so that people can actually search on Google search and say, I want to use Linux. And it shows up the one distribution that matters, not 100 of them. And with that, I finished the video. I hope you enjoy this. If you agree with me, leave it in the comments. If you don't, well, we can argue, I suppose. In all honesty, I could be wrong. And the next week, we actually have like a boost of Linux users everywhere, and stuff changes completely dramatically, and this video becomes completely obsolete. If that even happens, then I don't even care. Awesome, we finally have real competition to Windows. Maybe Microsoft should be scared now. Maybe they should stop doing this weird stuff that they have been doing over the last decade or something. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care and bye.